Bullies mocked her outfit and tore it. Seconds later, she choked him out. Kenna Bridgework adjusted her thrift store cardigan for the 100th time as she walked through the halls of Riverside High School. The fabric was soft but faded, and she knew it didn't match the designer clothes that seemed to flow through these corridors like water. Her dark hair fell in loose waves around her shoulders, framing a face that might have been pretty if she ever lifted her eyes from the ground. She was thin in a way that made her seem fragile, all sharp angles and careful movements, as if she were afraid of taking up too much space in the world. The morning sun streamed through the tall windows of the main hallway, casting long shadows that Kenna tried to stick to as she made her way to first period. She'd been at Riverside for 3 months now, ever since her mom got the job at the local diner, and she still felt like a ghost haunting someone else's life. The other students moved around her like she was invisible, which was exactly how she preferred it. "Well, well, look what the thrift store threw up," came a voice that made Kenna's stomach clench. She didn't need to look up to know it was Bryce Keller, the golden boy of Riverside High, star quarterback, class president, and the kind of guy who seemed to have been born knowing exactly how the world worked in his favor. His voice carried that particular brand of casual cruelty that only came from someone who had never known real consequences. Kenna kept walking, her worn sneakers silent against the polished floor. She'd learned that ignoring him was the best strategy, even though it never really worked. Bryce traveled with his pack, Madison Torres, whose family owned half the businesses in town, and Jake Whitmore, who was almost as big as Bryce but twice as mean. They were the kind of kids who ruled high school with the casual confidence of people who knew they'd probably rule everything else too. "Hey, I'm talking to you," Bryce called out, his voice louder now. Other students began to slow down, sensing the familiar electricity of drama about to unfold. Kenna could feel their eyes on her, a mixture of curiosity and relief that they weren't the ones in the crosshairs. She paused at her locker, fingers trembling slightly as she worked the combination. The metal door swung open, and she pretended to search for a book while hoping they would just move on. But Bryce had that particular look in his eyes, the one that meant he was bored and needed entertainment. "That's quite an outfit," Madison said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "Very unique. Is that vintage? Like, really vintage?" The other students laughed, and Kenna felt heat rise in her cheeks. She'd put effort into this outfit, mixing the cardigan with a simple black skirt and her one pair of decent boots. It wasn't much, but it was hers. "Leave her alone," came a quiet voice from behind them. Kenna turned to see Derek Chambers, a guy from her English class who always sat in the back and read during lunch. He was tall and lanky, with intelligent eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. He'd been kind to her since she started at Riverside, lending her pencils and sharing his notes when she missed class. "Oh, look," Jake said, grinning. "The nerd brigade is forming up." He took a step toward Derek, who stood his ground even though he was clearly outmatched. "You got something to say, bookworm?" Derek's jaw tightened. "I said leave her alone." This was exactly what Kenna had been afraid of. She didn't want anyone else getting hurt because of her. "It's fine," she said quickly, closing her locker. "I was just leaving anyway." But Bryce stepped into her path, his blue eyes cold. "Actually, I don't think you were. I think you were about to tell us about your fashion choices. See, Madison here is always looking for new trends, and she's fascinated by your aesthetic." The circle of students around them was growing larger now, phones appearing as if by magic. Kenna felt trapped, like a deer in headlights. She knew what came next, the systematic humiliation, the laughter, the way everyone would look at her for the rest of the day. She'd been through this before at her old school, and she'd thought maybe things would be different here. What none of them knew was that Kenna had spent the last 5 years of her life in a completely different world. Every Tuesday and Thursday evening, while other kids were at home doing homework or hanging out with friends, she was at Master Chen's dojo across town, learning Brazilian jiu-jitsu. Her mom had enrolled her after a particularly bad incident at her previous school, thinking it might help her daughter's confidence. Instead, it had become Kenna's sanctuary, the one place where she felt powerful and in control. Master Chen had taught her that true strength wasn't about hurting people. It was about protecting yourself and others when all other options were exhausted. He drilled into her that violence was always the last resort and that the best fight was the one you never had to have. Kenna had taken those lessons to heart, even when every instinct screamed at her to use what she knew. "You know what I think?" Bryce said, reaching out to finger the fabric of her cardigan. "I think you're trying too hard to be something you're not. This whole mysterious, quiet girl thing, it's not working for you." Kenna pulled back, but there was nowhere to go. The lockers were behind her, and the crowd was pressing in from all sides. She could feel her heart pounding, the familiar surge of adrenaline that came before a fight. But she forced herself to stay calm, to breathe the way Master Chen had taught her. "Just leave me alone," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "What was that?" Jake cupped his ear dramatically. "I didn't hear you. Did you guys hear anything?" The crowd laughed, and Kenna felt something inside her crack just a little, but she held firm. Getting expelled from another school wasn't an option. Her mum was barely making ends meet as it was, and they couldn't afford to move again. She had to endure this, just like she'd endured everything else. The bell rang and the crowd began to disperse, but Bryce wasn't done. "Same time tomorrow?" he said with a grin. "I'll be looking forward to your next fashion statement." As the hallway emptied, Derek approached her. "You okay?" Kenna nodded, not trusting her voice. She wasn't okay, but she couldn't explain why without revealing things she wasn't ready to share. Instead, she gathered her books and headed to class, feeling Derek's concerned gaze following her. The pattern continued for weeks. Every day brought new humiliations, new reasons for Bryce and his friends to single her out. They'd knock her books out of her hands in the hallway, make loud comments about her clothes during lunch, and find ways to exclude her from group projects in class. The worst part was that the teachers seemed to turn a blind eye, as if dealing with teenage cruelty was beneath their pay grade. One particularly rough day, Kenna found herself in the school's rarely used basement bathroom, trying to wash food stains out of her shirt. Madison had accidentally bumped into her during lunch, sending her tray flying. The sauce from her pizza had splattered across her white blouse, and she couldn't afford to replace it. As she scrubbed at the stains with paper towels, she heard footsteps in the hallway outside. The basement was usually empty during lunch, which was why she'd chosen it. But apparently, she wasn't the only one who knew about this hiding spot. "Hey!" came Derek's voice. "Are you down here?" Kenna sighed and opened the door. Derek stood in the dim hallway, looking concerned. "I saw what happened in the cafeteria. Are you okay?" "I'm fine," she said automatically, then looked down at her stained shirt. "Well, mostly fine." Derek pulled off his hoodie and held it out to her. "Here, you can wear this for the rest of the day." It was a simple gesture, but it hit Kenna harder than she expected. When was the last time someone had shown her such basic kindness? She took the hoodie, noting how it smelled like laundry detergent and something uniquely Derek, clean and warm and safe. "Thank you," she said, pulling it on. It was too big for her, but it was clean and soft, and it made her feel protected somehow. "You know," Derek said carefully, "you don't have to just take it. What they're doing to you, it's not okay." Kenna looked at him, this sweet guy who read philosophy books for fun and always had a kind word for everyone. How could she explain that she could probably take down all three of her tormentors without breaking a sweat, but that doing so would destroy everything she'd worked for? "It's complicated," she said finally. "Life usually is," Derek replied, "but that doesn't mean you have to face it alone." Something shifted in Kenna's chest at those words. For the first time in months, she felt like maybe she wasn't completely invisible. Derek saw her, really saw her, and that meant everything. But that small moment of connection only made what happened next so much worse. The breaking point came 3 weeks later, during what should have been a normal Thursday afternoon. Kenna was walking to the library when she heard raised voices from the parking lot. Through the window, she could see Derek confronting Bryce near the football team's practice field. She couldn't hear what they were saying, but Derek's body language was angry in a way she'd never seen before. He was gesturing emphatically, his usually calm demeanor cracking. Bryce stood with his arms crossed, that familiar smirk on his face, while Jake and Madison flanked him like bodyguards. Kenna's blood ran cold when she realized what was happening. Derek was standing up for her, and it was going to end badly. She rushed outside, her heart pounding. As she got closer, she could hear fragments of their conversation. "Treating her like garbage. And for what?" Derek was saying. "Because she doesn't fit into your little bubble." "Listen, hero," Bryce replied, his voice dangerously calm. "Nobody asked you to white knight for the charity case. Maybe you should mind your own business." "She is my business," Derek shot back, and Kenna felt her chest tighten. "And I'm sick of watching you make her life miserable." That's when Bryce's expression changed, becoming something cold and calculating. "Oh, I see. You got a little crush on the thrift store princess. That's sweet, really sweet." "Don't," Derek warned, but it was too late. Bryce had found his angle. "What do you think, Madison? Should we tell Derek here what we really think about his girlfriend's fashion choices?" Madison giggled, a sound like breaking glass. "Oh, you mean how she looks like she gets dressed in the dark? Or how she always smells like that weird incense from the second-hand store?" "That's enough," Derek said, stepping forward, but Jake was ready for him, shoving Derek back hard enough to send him stumbling. "Stay in your lane, bookworm," Jake said, "or we'll make sure you join your girlfriend in the loser category." Kenna was close enough now to see Derek's face, flushed with anger, and something else, hurt. He was putting himself at risk for her, and she couldn't let that happen. "Derek!" she called out, jogging over. "What's going on?" All four of them turned to look at her, and she saw the exact moment when Bryce's cruel smile widened. He'd found his perfect opportunity. "Oh, perfect timing," he said. "We were just discussing your fashion sense with your boyfriend here." "He's not my boyfriend," Kenna said quickly, but the damage was done. The idea was out there now, and she could see the wheels turning in Bryce's head. "Right," Madison said, looking between them. "Just friends. How sweet." "Actually," Bryce said, "I think we should get to know Derek better. After all, anyone who's willing to defend our little fashion victim here must be pretty special." The threat was clear, and Kenna felt panic rising in her chest. Getting bullied was one thing, she could handle that. But watching Derek get hurt because of her, that was unacceptable. "Leave him alone," she said, stepping protectively in front of Derek. "Your problem is with me, not him." "Oh, I don't have a problem with you," Bryce said, his voice smooth as silk. "I just think you could use some fashion advice, right, Madison?" Before Kenna could react, Madison reached out and grabbed the hem of Derek's hoodie, the one Kenna was still wearing from that day in the bathroom. "This is cute," she said, fingering the fabric. "Very charitable." "Don't touch her," Derek said, moving around Kenna to face them directly. His hands were shaking slightly, but his voice was steady. "Or what?" Jake asked, grinning. "You'll bore us to death with your book reports." That's when everything went wrong. Derek, sweet Derek, who had never hurt anyone in his life, took a swing at Jake. It was awkward and telegraphed, the kind of punch that belonged in movies rather than real fights. Jake caught his wrist easily, twisting Derek's arm behind his back. "Bad choice, bookworm," Jake said, forcing Derek to his knees. "Let him go," Kenna said, her voice sharp with command. Something in her tone made Jake pause, but only for a moment. "I don't think so," Bryce said, studying her face. I think Derek here needs to learn some respect. And I think you need to learn what happens when you send your boyfriend to fight your battles." The next few seconds happened in slow motion. Madison reached for the zipper of Derek's hoodie, intending to pull it off Kenna in some twisted act of humiliation. But the zipper caught, and in her frustration, Madison yanked hard enough to tear the fabric. The sound of ripping cloth was loud in the afternoon air, and Kenna watched in horror as Derek's favorite hoodie, the one he'd given her when she needed it most, came apart in Madison's hands. "Oops," Madison said, not sounding sorry at all. "I guess it was cheaper than I thought." Derek's face went white. "That was my dad's," he said quietly. "He gave it to me before he died." The parking lot went silent. Even Bryce seemed to realize they'd crossed a line. But it was too late. The damage was done. Derek's most precious possession lay in tatters on the asphalt, and Kenna could see the devastation in his eyes. Something inside her snapped. All those months of careful control, all of Master Chen's lessons about restraint and responsibility, all of her fears about starting over again, none of it mattered anymore. These people had hurt the one person who had shown her kindness, and they'd done it because of her. "You're going to pay for that," Kenna said, her voice deadly quiet. Bryce laughed, but it sounded forced. "Oh, really? What are you going to do? Write us a strongly worded letter?" Kenna didn't answer. Instead, she did something she'd never done before. She let her stance shift just slightly. Her feet found their proper position, her weight centered, her hands loose at her sides. To anyone who didn't know what to look for, she still appeared to be the same quiet, defenseless girl, but there was something different now, a coiled energy that seemed to radiate from her very core. Derek, still on his knees with Jake holding his arm, looked up at her with confusion. "Kenna, don't. It's not worth it." But it was worth it. Derek was worth it. The way he'd defended her, the way he'd seen her as a person instead of a target, the way he'd shared his most precious possession with her, all of it was worth fighting for. "Let him go," she said again. And this time, there was no mistaking the authority in her voice. Jake just laughed and wrenched Derek's arm harder, making him gasp in pain. "Make me fashion victim." Later, Kenna would remember this as the moment when everything changed, not just for her, but for everyone watching. Because in that instant, she stopped being the quiet girl who took whatever the world threw at her and became something else entirely. She moved faster than anyone expected, closing the distance between herself and Jake in 2 quick steps. Her hand shot out, not in a punch but in a precise strike, to a pressure point on his wrist. Jake's grip on Derek loosened immediately, his fingers going numb. "What the hell?" Jake started to say, but Kenna was already moving again. She grabbed his extended arm and used his own momentum against him, stepping to the side and guiding him into a throw that sent him crashing to the ground. It was textbook jiu-jitsu, the kind of technique that looked effortless but required years of practice to master. The sound of Jake hitting the asphalt was like a thunderclap in the suddenly silent parking lot. For a moment, nobody moved. Then Bryce stepped forward, his face flushed with anger. "You little bitch!" he snarled, reaching for her. Kenna didn't flinch. Instead, she shifted her weight again, this time into a defensive stance that Master Chen had drilled into her thousands of times. When Bryce's hand came toward her, she was ready. She caught his wrist in a grip that was deceptively gentle, then twisted and stepped, using leverage instead of strength to send him stumbling past her. As he tried to recover, she moved behind him, her arms sliding around his neck in a rear naked choke. "I said let him go," she whispered in Bryce's ear, her voice calm, despite the adrenaline flooding her system. "I meant it." Bryce clawed at her arm, but Kenna had positioned herself perfectly. She wasn't cutting off his air completely, just enough to make him understand how helpless he was. Around them, the crowd that had gathered was dead silent, phones recording every second. "Kenna," Derek said, his voice worried. "That's enough." She looked at him, this sweet boy who had shown her kindness when no one else would, and something in his eyes made her remember who she was. She wasn't like them. She wasn't cruel or vindictive. She was better than that. Slowly she released the choke, letting Bryce stumble away from her. He turned to face her, his face red and his breathing labored, but the arrogance was gone from his eyes. In its place was something she'd never seen before. Fear. "Stay away from him," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the parking lot. "Stay away from both of us, and if I ever see you hurting someone again, if I ever see you using your position to make someone else's life miserable, I will finish what we started here today." Madison, who had been frozen in shock, finally found her voice. "You can't just attack people. I'm telling the principal." "Good," Kenna said, turning to face her. "Tell him everything. Tell him how you've been making my life hell for months. Tell him how you destroyed Derek's hoodie for fun. Tell him how you've been using your social status to bully people weaker than you." Madison's mouth opened and closed like a fish, but no sound came out. She looked to Bryce for support, but he was still catching his breath, one hand rubbing his throat. Jake had managed to get to his feet, his face a mask of rage and humiliation. "This isn't over," he said, starting toward her again. But Derek stepped between them, and something in his posture had changed too. He wasn't the same quiet boy who had been forced to his knees just minutes ago. He stood taller now, his shoulders back, his eyes fierce with protective anger. "Yes, it is," he said firmly. "It's over. All of it." For a moment, the five of them stood in a circle, the air thick with tension and the weight of everything that had just changed. Then, slowly, Jake backed down. He looked at Kenna, at the way she stood with perfect balance and controlled breathing, and seemed to realize that this was not a fight he could win. "Come on," he said to the others. "This isn't worth it." But Bryce didn't move. He was staring at Kenna with a mixture of disbelief and something that might have been respect. "Where did you learn to do that?" he asked quietly. Kenna considered not answering, but something in his tone, the genuine curiosity beneath the question, made her decide to be honest. "I've been training since I was 12, she said. "Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. My mom thought it would help with my confidence." "Did it work?" he asked, and there was no mockery in his voice now. Kenna looked around at the crowd of students who were staring at her with new eyes, at Derek who was looking at her like she was some kind of superhero, at the three people who had made her life miserable for months and were now seeing her as she really was for the first time. "Yeah," she said quietly. "I think it did." The crowd began to disperse, students heading back to their cars or toward the school building. But the energy in the air had changed completely. Instead of the usual mix of fear and anticipation that surrounded confrontations like this, there was something else, a sense that justice had been served, that the natural order had been restored. As Bryce walked away, he paused and turned back to her. "For what it's worth," he said, "I'm sorry. About the hoodie, about all of it. It wasn't much, but it was something, an acknowledgement that lines had been crossed, that real damage had been done." Kenna nodded, accepting the apology for what it was. Derek knelt down and gathered up the pieces of his torn hoodie, his face sad, but not bitter. "It's just a piece of clothing," he said, but Kenna could hear the hurt in his voice. "No, it wasn't," she said, kneeling beside him. "It was important to you. It mattered." He looked at her, really looked at her, and she saw the exact moment when his perception of her shifted completely. "You could have done that any time," he said. "You could have stopped all of this months ago." "I know." "Why didn't you?" Kenna thought about how to answer that, how to explain the weight of responsibility that came with knowing you could hurt people. The fear of becoming the very thing you despised, the way violence always seemed to create more problems than it solved. Because once you cross that line, she said finally, you can't go back, and I didn't want to become like them. Derek nodded slowly, understanding. But you did it anyway. For me. You stood up for me, Kenna said. Nobody's ever done that before. They sat there in the empty parking lot, surrounded by the pieces of his father's hoodie, and something passed between them that was deeper than words. It was the recognition of kindness given and received, of courage in the face of cruelty, of the moment when two people realize they're not alone in the world. Over the following weeks, everything changed at Riverside High. The story of the quiet girl who had taken down the school's biggest bully spread like wildfire, growing in the telling until it became legend. But the reality was subtler and more important than any story. Bryce didn't become a different person overnight, but he stopped being cruel. He still held his position as the golden boy of the school, but he used it differently now. When he saw someone being picked on, he intervened. When his friends started to gang up on someone weaker, he shut it down. It was as if being forced to confront his own vulnerability had shown him the humanity in others. Madison and Jake took longer to change, but the shift was noticeable. Without Bryce's approval, their casual cruelty lost its power. They still ran in their exclusive circles, but the edge of meanness was gone. They'd learned that there were consequences to their actions, and that knowledge made them more careful. For Kenna, the transformation was more complex. She was no longer invisible, which was both a blessing and a curse. Students who had never noticed her before now went out of their way to nod in the hallways. Teachers who had ignored her raised hands suddenly seemed eager to hear her thoughts. She'd gained respect, but she'd also lost the protective anonymity that had been her shield. The hardest part was learning to trust her new reputation. For months, she'd been defined by her weakness, by what she couldn't or wouldn't do. Now she was defined by her strength, by that moment when she'd chosen to fight back. Both definitions felt incomplete, like they were missing essential parts of who she really was. But Derek helped her navigate this new reality. He understood better than anyone the weight of being seen differently, of having to live up to a moment of courage that had defined you in other people's eyes. Together, they found their footing in this changed landscape. Their friendship deepened into something more over the following months. It started with shared lunches in the library, then walks home from school, then long conversations about books and dreams, and the strange experience of being teenagers in a world that seemed to make no sense. Derek showed her that kindness wasn't weakness, and Kenna showed him that strength didn't have to mean cruelty. The torn hoodie became a symbol between them. Derek kept the pieces, not out of sadness, but as a reminder of the day when everything changed. And Kenna, with her mother's help, learned to sew so she could put it back together. It wasn't the same. The seams were visible, the fabric patched in places, but it was whole again, different, but whole. One evening, as they sat on the steps outside the school after a particularly long day, Derek asked her the question she'd been waiting for. Do you regret it? Fighting back? Kenna considered this carefully. She thought about the months of torment, the way she'd felt invisible and worthless. She thought about the moment when she'd seen Derek on his knees, hurt because of her. She thought about the choice she'd made and all the choices that had led to it. No, she said finally. I regret that it took me so long. Derek smiled, and it was like sunshine breaking through clouds. I'm glad you waited, he said. If you'd done it sooner, I might not have had the chance to know you first. The real you, not the warrior everyone sees now. It was a sweet thing to say, and it made Kenna realize something important. She wasn't just the quiet girl who got picked on, and she wasn't just the fighter who had stood up to the bullies. She was both of those things and more, A complex person with strengths and weaknesses, someone who had learned to be kind without being weak and strong without being cruel. The lesson she'd learned wasn't just about fighting back, though that was part of it. It was about knowing when to fight and when to walk away, about using your strength to protect rather than to dominate, about the difference between justice and revenge. Master Chen had been right. The best fight was the one you never had to have. But sometimes, when all other options were exhausted, when someone you cared about was in danger, sometimes you had to be willing to step into the arena. As the sun set over Riverside High, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, Kenna felt a peace she hadn't known in months. She was no longer the girl who took whatever the world threw at her, but she hadn't become the thing she'd always feared either. She'd found a middle path, a way to be strong without being cruel, to demand respect without becoming a bully herself. The next morning, she would wake up and put on clothes that she'd chosen because she liked them, not because she was afraid of what others might think. She would walk through the halls with her head up, knowing that she had nothing to hide and nothing to prove. And if someone needed defending, if someone weaker was being picked on by someone stronger, she would be ready. But for now, she sat with Derek on the school steps, watching the last light fade from the sky, and felt grateful for the long journey that had brought her to this moment. She'd learned that true strength wasn't about being the toughest person in the room. It was about being the person who was willing to stand up when standing up mattered most.